Before 1941, Europe was a powder keg, ready to explode. The continent had been slowly twisting into a dangerous shape ever since the end of the First World War, with old empires crumbling and new aggressive ideologies taking root. Germany, under the iron fist of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, was openly seeking to expand its borders and establish a vast new empire. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, also harbored dreams of a revived Roman Empire, while Japan was busy asserting its dominance in Asia. These totalitarian regimes shared a common thread, a belief in their own racial or national superiority, and an absolute disregard for international law or the sovereignty of other nations. They built massive armies, preached aggressive expansion, and silenced any dissent, creating a climate of fear and ambition that overshadowed everything else. The League of Nations, meant to prevent another global conflict, proved utterly powerless against this rising tide of aggression. Treaties were signed and then broken, promises made and then forgotten, as each new act of defiance pushed Europe closer and closer to the edge. At the heart of the coming storm was an irreconcilable clash between two diametrically opposed worldviews. On one side stood Nazi Germany, fueled by an ideology of racial purity, aggressive nationalism, and a fanatical hatred of communism. Hitler saw the Soviet Union as a vast land ripe for colonization, its Slavic population fit for servitude, and its Jewish population destined for extermination. He believed in crushing Bolshevism, which he viewed as a global threat, and saw the war against the Soviets as an ideological crusade. On the other side was the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, a communist state built on the principles of international socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. While also a totalitarian regime, the Soviet Union preached the liberation of the working class and the overthrow of capitalist systems worldwide. Their ideologies were like oil and water, fundamentally incompatible, each viewing the other as an existential threat that had to be eliminated for their own survival and the triumph of their vision for the future. Yet, despite this deep-seated hostility, a temporary and deeply cynical peace had been forged in August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world. It was a deal made out of pure strategic opportunism. Germany wanted to avoid a two-front war while it dealt with Poland and then Western Europe. The Soviet Union, weakened by purges and distrustful of Western powers, sought to buy time to rebuild its military and expand its own influence. The public face of the pact was a simple non-aggression agreement, but its true significance lay in its secret protocols. These protocols carved up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, essentially dividing Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and parts of Romania between the two powers. It was a pact born of mutual distrust and convenience, a temporary truce before the inevitable showdown, and it allowed Hitler the freedom to launch his invasion of Poland just a week later, kick-starting World War II. While the pact created an uneasy lull, Germany was already meticulously planning its next move. Operation Barbarossa, the codename for the invasion of the Soviet Union, was not some spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a vast, ambitious undertaking, planned with chilling precision. German strategists pored over maps, assessing terrain, infrastructure, and potential resistance. Massive troop concentrations began to build up along the Soviet border, disguised as training exercises or defensive maneuvers. Logistical preparations were immense, involving the stockpiling of fuel, ammunition, and supplies for millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, and thousands of aircraft. Intelligence gathering was also critical, with German spies and reconnaissance flights constantly probing Soviet defenses, looking for weaknesses and assessing their capabilities. Every detail, from the timing of the attack to the division of forces into three massive army groups, was carefully considered, all aimed at achieving a swift and decisive victory. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union remained tragically unprepared for the onslaught. Several factors contributed to this vulnerability. Stalin's brutal purges in the late 1930s had decimated the Red Army's officer corps, removing many of its most experienced and capable commanders. Those who remained were often cautious and unwilling to contradict Stalin, fearing for their lives. There was also a significant underestimation of German capabilities, despite warnings from intelligence sources. Stalin, perhaps blinded by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, believed Hitler would not risk a war on the Eastern Front while still engaged in the West. Strategic miscalculations were also rampant. Soviet forces were often deployed too far forward, close to the border, making them vulnerable to encirclement. Their equipment, while plentiful, was often outdated, and their logistical systems were cumbersome and inefficient. The Soviet Union was a sleeping giant, but one whose defenses were riddled with cracks. The morning of June 22, 1941, brought a brutal awakening. The element of surprise was complete and devastating. Without a declaration of war, millions of German soldiers, supported by overwhelming air power, surged across the vast Soviet frontier. The scale and suddenness of the invasion were unlike anything seen before. German tanks, artillery and aircraft struck simultaneously along a front stretching thousands of kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Soviet High Command, caught completely off guard, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the attack. Stalin himself was reportedly in a state of shock and disbelief for days. For the average Soviet citizen, the invasion was a terrifying, unexpected nightmare, shattering the fragile peace and plunging them into a conflict that would define their generation and forever alter the course of history. The initial hours of Operation Barbarossa unfolded with a terrifying efficiency that stunned the world. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the German war machine roared to life. A massive artillery barrage, unprecedented in its scale, hammered Soviet border defenses, airfields and communication centers. Simultaneously, waves of Luftwaffe bombers swept across the sky, targeting Soviet air bases and destroying thousands of aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. This aerial assault crippled the Soviet Air Force in a single day, giving the Germans immediate air superiority, a crucial advantage that would last for months. Following the aerial and artillery bombardment, millions of German soldiers, organized into three immense army groups, North, Center and South, stormed across the 900-kilometer front. It was the largest invasion in human history, a staggering display of military might designed to overwhelm and annihilate. The Wehrmacht's strategy was pure Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't about slowly grinding through defenses, it was about speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Panzer divisions, spearheading the advance, punched deep into Soviet territory, bypassing strongpoints and creating chaos behind the lines. Infantry divisions followed, tasked with mopping up bypassed Soviet units and securing the flanks. Combined arms tactics were expertly employed, with tanks, motorized infantry, artillery and air support working together seamlessly. German units moved with incredible speed, exploiting the vast, open terrain of the Soviet Union. Roads, though often poor, were used to their full extent, and the element of surprise allowed them to cover ground at a rate that astonished even the Germans themselves. The objective was clear: to encircle and destroy large Red Army formations before they could organize an effective defense. The immediate aftermath for the Red Army was catastrophic. Caught completely off guard, Soviet units along the border were shattered. Many were still in their barracks when the attack began, their weapons in storage, Communication lines were severed, command and control broke down, and units were often left without orders or guidance. German panzer groups quickly formed massive encirclements, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The Battle of Białystok-Minsk, just days into the invasion, resulted in the capture of over 300,000 Soviet troops. Further east, the Uman Pocket and the Smolensk encirclement added hundreds of thousands more to the staggering prisoner count. Entire armies were simply wiped off the map. Soldiers who survived the initial onslaught often found themselves cut off, fighting desperate, isolated battles against a superior, well-organized enemy. The sheer number of casualties and prisoners in the first weeks was almost incomprehensible, a testament to the effectiveness of the German Blitzkrieg and the Soviet Union's profound unpreparedness. With their initial objectives largely achieved, the German armies pressed deeper into Soviet territory, each with a specific strategic goal. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, advanced through the Baltic states, aiming for Leningrad, the former imperial capital and a city of immense symbolic importance. Their path was relatively easier, as the terrain was more favorable, and Soviet resistance initially weaker in that sector. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was the largest and most powerful of the three. Its primary objective was Moscow, the Soviet capital, the heart of the Soviet Union. This group faced the most direct resistance, but also achieved the most spectacular early victories, rapidly conquering vast swathes of Belarus. Finally, Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, pushed into Ukraine, a region vital for its agricultural output and industrial capacity, and a key target for Hitler's Lebensraum ideology. This group also had to contend with larger Soviet forces and more determined resistance. Despite the overwhelming odds and the initial chaos, pockets of fierce Soviet resistance began to emerge. Though disorganized, many Red Army soldiers fought with incredible bravery and determination, often to the last man. The defenders of the Brest fortress, for example, held out for weeks against overwhelming German forces long after they had been encircled, becoming a symbol of Soviet resilience. Isolated units, cut off from their commands, often formed partisan groups, striking at German supply lines and harassing the invaders. These acts of defiance, while not altering the immediate strategic picture, forced the Germans to commit more troops to security duties and slowed their overall advance in certain sectors. The sheer vastness of the Soviet Union, coupled with the growing ferocity of the defense, meant that even a lightning war would eventually face friction. Stalin's initial response to the invasion was a mix of paralysis and disbelief. For days, he was reportedly in a state of shock, withdrawing from public view. When he finally addressed the Soviet people on July 3rd, his voice was reportedly weak, but his message was clear. This was a war of national survival, an existential threat to the Soviet homeland. He called for a scorched earth policy, urging civilians to destroy anything that could be of use to the enemy as they retreated. He rallied the population with appeals to patriotism and the defense of Mother Russia, shifting the narrative from a war for communism to a great patriotic war. This rallying cry, combined with the brutal reality of the German advance, began to galvanize the Soviet people and lay the groundwork for the monumental struggle that lay ahead. The initial shock was giving way to a grim determination, setting the stage for a conflict of unparalleled scale and savagery. As the German armies pushed deeper into Soviet lands, the initial speed of their advance began to slow. The vast distances of the Eastern Front, far greater than anything encountered in Western Europe, started to take their toll. German supply lines, already stretched thin, became increasingly vulnerable. Roads were few and often poorly maintained, turning into muddy tracks with the slightest rain. Trucks broke down, fuel ran low, and spare parts became scarce. The logistical machine that had powered the Blitzkrieg across smaller, more developed countries struggled to keep up with the demands of an invasion on this unprecedented scale. Every kilometer gained meant more effort to bring up food, ammunition, and fuel to the front lines. This growing strain on logistics was a silent but relentless enemy, gradually eroding the Wehrmacht's operational efficiency and setting the stage for future difficulties. In response to the relentless German advance, the Soviet Union implemented a brutal but strategically necessary scorched earth policy. As Red Army units and civilians retreated, they systematically destroyed anything that could be of use to the enemy. Factories were dismantled and moved eastward, sometimes piece by piece, to be reassembled beyond the Urals. Crops were burned in the fields, livestock driven away or slaughtered, bridges blown up, and railway tracks torn apart. Towns and villages were set ablaze. This policy, ordered by Stalin himself, inflicted immense suffering on the local population, who often lost everything. However, it also denied the Germans vital resources, forcing them to rely even more heavily on their overstretched supply lines and further complicating their efforts to sustain their offensive. The landscape itself became a weapon, barren and hostile to the invaders. One of the most tragic and enduring symbols of this early phase of the war was the siege of Leningrad. As Army Group North advanced, they encircled the city by early September 1941. Hitler's order was clear. Leningrad was to be wiped from the face of the earth, its population starved. The siege began, trapping millions of civilians and soldiers within its perimeter. All land routes were cut off, and the only connection to the outside world became a precarious route across Lake Ladoga, later known as the Road of Life. The immediate impact on the city's inhabitants was devastating. Food rations quickly dwindled, leading to widespread starvation. Temperatures plummeted in the brutal Russian winter, and fuel became almost non-existent. The lack of sanitation and medical supplies led to rampant disease. For 900 days, the people of Leningrad endured unimaginable hardship, a grim testament to the barbarity of total war. While German forces pushed towards Leningrad, another critical battle was unfolding further south, near the city of Smolensk. This engagement, which lasted from July to September 1941, became a pivotal early test of strength. Here, Soviet forces, despite being repeatedly encircled and suffering heavy losses, managed to mount a determined defense. The Germans, expecting a swift breakthrough, found themselves bogged down in fierce fighting. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, commanding the Western Front, organized a series of counterattacks that, while costly, significantly delayed Army Group Center's advance on Moscow. The Battle of Smolensk showcased a growing Soviet defensive capability and proved that the Red Army, even in defeat, could inflict considerable damage and slow the seemingly unstoppable German war machine. It bought precious time for Moscow to organize its defenses. Further south, Army Group South achieved one of the largest encirclements in military history. In September 1941, the German forces, with a brilliant pincer movement, trapped vast numbers of Soviet troops around Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. The Kiev encirclement resulted in the capture of over 600 Soviet soldiers, a catastrophic loss for the Red Army. This victory opened the way for the Germans to seize the rich agricultural lands of Ukraine and access the Donbass industrial region. However, this massive tactical victory came at a strategic cost. The diversion of troops, particularly from Army Group Center, to assist in the Kiev operation, delayed the main thrust towards Moscow. This delay, though seemingly minor at the time, would prove to be crucial as the Russian winter approached and the window for a decisive strike on the Soviet capital began to close. By late autumn, the German push towards the Soviet capital Moscow intensified. The city, a symbolic and strategic prize, was now clearly in peril. Hitler believed that capturing Moscow would deal a fatal blow to the Soviet will to resist. Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow, was launched in October. German forces, despite their increasing logistical woes and the growing ferocity of Soviet resistance, were still powerful. The Soviet leadership, under Stalin's direct command, recognized the existential threat. Desperate efforts were made to fortify the approaches to the city. Civilian labor brigades, including women and children, dug anti-tank ditches, built earthworks, and erected barricades. Factories in Moscow were converted to produce weapons and ammunition. Fresh divisions, some from Siberia and the Far East, were rushed to the front. The entire city became a fortress, preparing for what seemed like an inevitable climactic battle. The fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thread, poised on the edge of its own capital. The fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thread, poised on the edge of its own capital. As the German spearheads crept closer to Moscow in the late autumn of 1941, an unexpected and formidable enemy began to emerge. The Russian winter. The sudden and severe onset of winter weather presented unforeseen and crippling challenges for the German Wehrmacht. Temperatures plummeted rapidly, often dropping far below 0 degrees Celsius. This was not just cold. It was an extreme, bone-chilling cold that the German army was utterly unprepared for. The swift transition from autumn mud to deep snow and ice brought the German advance to a grinding halt. Their sophisticated machinery, designed for the temperate climate of Western Europe, began to seize up. Lubricants froze, engines refused to start, and even the simple act of firing a rifle became a struggle as mechanisms jammed. Soldiers, clad in inadequate summer uniforms, suffered terribly from frostbite and exposure. Supply lines, already stretched thin, became impassable as roads turned into icy death traps and rail lines became buried under snowdrifts. This frozen logistics nightmare crippled the German war machine, making every kilometer a monumental effort, just as the German offensive faltered. The Soviets launched a strategic counterattack outside Moscow in early December 1941. This was not a desperate, disorganized defense, but a well-planned and coordinated offensive, spearheaded by fresh Siberian divisions. These troops, accustomed to extreme cold, were well-equipped with winter clothing and boots, a stark contrast to their freezing German adversaries. They moved on skis, bypassing German strongpoints and striking at vulnerable flanks. General Georgy Zhukov, a brilliant and ruthless commander, played a critical role in planning and executing this counteroffensive. He had meticulously organized the defenses of Moscow, brought in reinforcements from the Far East, and prepared for the winter battle with foresight and determination. The German setbacks were immediate and severe. Caught off guard by the strength and ferocity of the Soviet counterattack and already weakened by the cold, the Wehrmacht was forced to retreat from the immediate vicinity of Moscow. This was the first major strategic defeat for the German army in World War II. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, was shattered. For the Soviets, the successful defense of Moscow and the subsequent pushback provided a massive morale boost. It showed that the Germans could be stopped, even driven back, and instilled a renewed sense of purpose and resilience in the Red Army and the Soviet people. Hitler, furious at the retreat, issued a stand-fast order, forbidding any further withdrawals, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for his army throughout the war. As 1941 bled into 1942, the Eastern Front became a war of attrition, a brutal struggle for survival. Germany's initial strategic objectives had failed. Moscow remained unconquered, and the Soviet Union, though grievously wounded, continued to fight. The focus of the war shifted, and Hitler, still fixated on destroying the Soviet Union, made a fateful decision to alter his strategic objectives for the upcoming summer campaign of 1942. Instead of another direct assault on Moscow, which had proven too costly and difficult, the German High Command decided to shift its main focus south. The new primary goal was the rich oil fields of the Caucasus region, vital for fueling the German war machine, and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad, an industrial center named after the Soviet leader, held immense symbolic as well as strategic value. Capturing it would secure the German flank and cut off Soviet access to the Volga, a crucial supply artery. The battle for Stalingrad began in earnest in late August 1942. The city, stretching along the Volga, became the epicenter of an unprecedented struggle. German forces, primarily the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, launched a massive assault. The fighting quickly devolved into the most brutal form of urban warfare. Every street, every building, every room became a battlefield. Snipers lurked in the rubble, machine gun nests guarded every intersection, and soldiers fought hand to hand in the ruins of factories and apartment blocks. The Germans, accustomed to rapid maneuver warfare, found themselves bogged down in a meat grinder, where their tactical advantages in armor and air support were negated by the close-quarters combat. The horrors of urban warfare in Stalingrad were unimaginable. Buildings were reduced to skeletal shells, the air thick with dust, smoke, and the stench of death. The constant shelling and bombing turned the city into a desolate landscape of debris and twisted metal. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme conditions, fighting for days without rest, often starving and freezing. The fighting was so intense and so personal that it became known as Rattenkrieg or Rat War. The Germans coined the term to describe the close quarters, subterranean fighting in the sewers and cellars, where life was cheap and death was constant. This was a battle for survival, where holding a single building could mean the difference between life and death for an entire unit. While the Germans slowly and painfully clawed their way into Stalingrad, the Soviets were secretly preparing a massive counteroffensive. This was Operation Uranus, a meticulously planned and brilliantly executed maneuver to encircle the German Sixth Army. The plan involved a double envelopment, with two powerful Soviet forces launching attacks from the north and south of Stalingrad, aiming to link up far behind the German front lines. The Soviet command, under the overall direction of General Zhukov, gathered vast numbers of troops, tanks and artillery in secret, often moving them at night and under strict radio silence to maintain surprise. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. The Soviet forces struck the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding the German flanks, quickly breaking through their lines. The speed and scale of the Soviet advance caught the Axis forces completely by surprise. Within days, the two Soviet pincer movements linked up near the town of Kalach, successfully encircling the entire German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army and various Romanian and Croatian units. Hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers, including General Paulus and his staff, were now trapped in a vast pocket, cut off from any hope of ground relief. The successful encirclement was a catastrophic blow to the German war effort. Hitler, however, refused to acknowledge the reality of the situation. He issued a catastrophic no-retreat order, forbidding Paulus from attempting a breakout. He believed that the Sixth Army could be resupplied by air and that a relief force would eventually reach them. This decision sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, condemning hundreds of thousands of men to a slow, agonizing death in the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and decisive battles in military history. The conditions for the encircled German forces inside the Stalingrad pocket quickly became desperate. Trapped, cut off, and facing a brutal Russian winter, the once proud Sixth Army began to disintegrate. Fuel ran out, rendering tanks and vehicles useless. Ammunition dwindled, making sustained defense impossible. Most critically, food supplies rapidly diminished. Rations were cut again and again, leading to widespread starvation. Soldiers, already weakened by months of relentless combat, now faced the added torment of extreme hunger and frostbite. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, and without proper winter clothing, thousands succumbed to exposure. The wounded, lying in makeshift aid stations with little to no medical supplies, endured unimaginable suffering. Gangrene and other infections spread unchecked. The promise of an airlift, which Hitler had guaranteed, became a cruel joke. German attempts to break through to the trapped army, like Operation Winterstorm, launched by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, ultimately ended in failure. Manstein's forces, though powerful, could not overcome the determined Soviet resistance in the vast, frozen landscape. They pushed to within 50 kilometers of the pocket, close enough for the trapped soldiers to hear the distant rumble of artillery, but they could not break through. The hope that briefly flickered among the besieged men was extinguished, replaced by a deeper despair. Every failed relief effort tightened the noose around the Sixth Army, confirming their isolation and inevitable doom. The promised air bridge also failed spectacularly. The Luftwaffe simply did not have enough transport planes to adequately resupply the vast numbers of encircled troops. What little cargo made it through often consisted of non-essential items or was destroyed by Soviet anti-aircraft fire or fighter planes. The few planes that did land on the makeshift airstrips within the pocket often became stranded themselves due to mechanical issues or lack of fuel. Instead of the hundreds of tons of supplies needed daily, only a fraction arrived, a trickle that barely sustained a few thousand men, let alone an entire army of over 250,000. The planes that flew in wounded soldiers often returned empty, a grim testament to the lack of outgoing cargo. Desperation and attrition became the dominant themes within the Stalingrad pocket. The slow, agonizing collapse of German resistance was a testament to the brutal reality of Hitler's no-retreat order. Soldiers fought with dwindling hope, knowing that surrender was forbidden and relief was unlikely. Morale plummeted and discipline frayed. Many froze to death in their foxholes, their bodies later found perfectly preserved by the extreme cold. Others simply gave up, waiting for the inevitable. The once formidable units of the Wehrmacht were reduced to starving, frost-bitten remnants, their fighting spirit eroded by the relentless cold, hunger, and constant Soviet pressure. Soviet artillery and air attacks pounded the pocket day and night, gradually shrinking its perimeter and grinding down the last vestiges of German resistance. Field Marshal Paulus, trapped with his army, repeatedly requested permission to attempt a breakout or to surrender. Each time, Hitler personally denied his requests, issuing increasingly irrational orders to hold out. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, reminding him that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The next day, Paulus, recognizing the futility of further resistance and unwilling to sacrifice more lives, defied Hitler's order. He surrendered the southern group of his forces. The remaining northern groups, under General Karl Strecker, surrendered 2 days later, on February 2, 1943. Paulus's surrender was a monumental psychological and strategic blow to Germany, marking the first time an entire German field army had been lost. The aftermath of Stalingrad was horrifying. Out of the roughly 250 to 300 Axis soldiers trapped, around 91 survived to be taken prisoner. Of these, only about 5 eventually returned home to Germany after the war, many years later, having endured brutal conditions in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps. The immense human cost of the battle was staggering for both sides, but particularly for the Germans who lost an entire army. For the Soviet Union, the victory came at an unimaginable price, with over 1 million casualties sustained throughout the battle. Stalingrad was more than just a battle. It was a turning point. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, solidified Soviet resolve, and irrevocably shifted the momentum of the war on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, The initiative largely belonged to the Red Army, and the German war machine was forced into a long, grinding retreat. The offensive power of the Wehrmacht was broken, and the path to Berlin, though long and bloody, had begun to open. After the devastating loss at Stalingrad, Germany found itself in a difficult position, but the war was far from over. German leadership, still believing in their capacity to turn the tide, began planning another massive offensive for 1943. This wasn't just about regaining lost ground. It was about reasserting dominance and crippling the Soviet war effort before it could fully recover. The target was the Kursk salient, a large bulge in the front line that jutted into German-held territory. It presented a tempting opportunity for a pincer movement, a classic German tactic to encircle and destroy large Soviet forces. The German plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was ambitious. It called for two strong German forces, one from the north and one from the south, to cut off the base of the Kursk salient. The offensive would rely heavily on Germany's newest and most powerful tanks, the Panther and the Tiger. These machines were designed to be superior to anything the Soviets had, with thicker armor and more powerful guns. German strategists believed that a concentrated strike with these new tanks would punch through Soviet lines, break their morale, and allow the Wehrmacht to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Extensive preparations were made, including the assembly of vast numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, and infantry. Commanders meticulously studied maps, and soldiers were briefed on the importance of the upcoming battle. Delays, however, plagued the operation, allowing the Soviets precious time to prepare. The Red Army, having learned harsh lessons from earlier defeats and now bolstered by the victory at Stalingrad, was not caught off guard. Soviet intelligence had provided accurate information about the German plans, including the timing and general direction of the attack. This allowed the Soviets to undertake an unprecedented level of defensive preparation. They built multiple, deep defensive lines, creating a layered defense that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. These lines included vast minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and hundreds of dug-in anti-tank guns. Entire artillery divisions were positioned to cover specific sectors, ready to unleash devastating barrages on advancing German armor. Engineers worked tirelessly, constructing an intricate network of trenches, bunkers, and command posts. The sheer scale of these preparations was staggering, turning the Kursk salient into one of the most heavily fortified areas in military history. The Soviets were not just planning to stop the Germans, they were planning to bleed them dry. When Operation Citadel finally launched in early July 1943, it immediately ran into this formidable Soviet defense. The German tanks, despite their power, struggled to cross the minefields and navigate the complex defensive layers. Each meter of advance came at a heavy cost. The fighting was brutal and relentless, with both sides committing enormous resources. The battle culminated in the colossal tank battle at Prokhorovka, a clash that would become legendary. On July 12, 1943, hundreds of German and Soviet tanks collided in a relatively small area. It wasn't a carefully planned engagement, but rather a chaotic, swirling melee of steel and fire. Tanks fired at close range, often becoming entangled in the wreckage of others. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the roar of engines and explosions. This was one of the largest armored engagements in history, a testament to the sheer scale and intensity of the fighting on the Eastern Front. The ground battles were matched by equally fierce aerial combat. Both the German Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force committed large numbers of aircraft to the battle, vying for control of the skies above Kursk. Fighters tangled in dogfights, while bombers and ground attack aircraft pounded enemy positions. The air superiority was hotly contested, with neither side able to achieve decisive dominance for long. Soviet pilots, many now with more combat experience than in the early days of the war, fought bravely, protecting their ground troops and harassing German formations. The skies over Kursk became a deadly arena, adding another layer of destruction to an already devastating battle. Ultimately, Operation Citadel was a decisive failure for Germany. Despite their initial gains and the enormous sacrifices made, the German forces were unable to break through the Soviet defenses. The Red Army's deep, layered defense and its ability to absorb heavy blows proved too much for the Wehrmacht. After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting, with heavy losses in tanks and manpower, Hitler called off the offensive. The failure at Kursk marked a turning point, not just in the battle, but in the entire war on the Eastern Front. It was the last major German offensive. From this point forward, the strategic initiative belonged almost entirely to the Red Army. The German war machine, once seemingly unstoppable, was now clearly on the defensive, forced into a long and arduous retreat that would eventually lead them back to Berlin. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk was more than just a tactical defeat for Germany. It was a fundamental shift in the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front. With the German offensive capability shattered, the Red Army seized the initiative, launching a series of powerful summer offensives that would relentlessly push the Wehrmacht back along the entire front. These were not small, localized attacks, but massive coordinated operations designed to exploit the German weakness and reclaim lost territory. The Soviet military machine, forged in the brutal fighting of the previous years, was now a formidable force, capable of complex maneuvers and sustained assaults. One of the most significant outcomes of these offensives was the systematic liberation of vast swathes of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine, a vital agricultural and industrial region, had been under German occupation since the early days of Barbarossa. Its liberation was a top priority for the Soviet Union, both for its strategic resources and for the morale boost it provided. The Red Army advanced steadily, often facing fierce resistance from German forces desperate to hold on to their gains. However, the sheer numerical superiority and improved tactical proficiency of the Soviets made their advance almost unstoppable. Cities and towns that had endured years of occupation were slowly freed, revealing the horrors inflicted by the German regime. The fighting was still intense, but the tide had clearly turned. The push through Ukraine was a grueling campaign, marked by heavy casualties on both sides, but the momentum was firmly with the Soviets. As the Red Army continued its westward push, the Germans attempted to establish a new defensive line along the Dnieper River. The Dnieper, one of Europe's largest rivers, presented a formidable natural barrier stretching for hundreds of kilometers. German engineers and troops worked feverishly to fortify its banks, hoping to create an impregnable defense that would halt the Soviet advance. They dug trenches, built bunkers, and laid extensive minefields, believing the river would give them the time they needed to regroup and stabilize the front. The Dnieper Line was envisioned as a new stronghold, a place where the Wehrmacht could finally stand firm. However, the Red Army was not to be deterred. In a series of audacious and incredibly costly operations, Soviet forces began crossing the Dnieper. These crossings were often conducted under heavy German fire, with waves of infantry and engineers attempting to establish bridgeheads on the western bank. Makeshift ferries, rafts, and even small fishing boats were used to transport troops and equipment across the wide, fast-flowing river. Casualties were immense, but the Soviet command understood the strategic importance of breaking the Dnieper Line. Each successful crossing, no matter how small or hard-won, represented a critical step in undermining the German defensive strategy. The determination and sheer will of the Soviet soldiers in these crossings were legendary, highlighting their unwavering commitment to push the invaders out of their homeland. Behind German lines, partisan warfare intensified in scale and effectiveness. Soviet partisans, operating in the vast forests and rural areas, became an increasingly potent force. They launched ambushes, sabotaged German supply lines, destroyed railway tracks, and attacked communication hubs. These actions severely disrupted German logistics and communications, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert valuable troops and resources to anti-partisan operations. The partisans acted as the eyes and ears of the Red Army, providing crucial intelligence and often coordinated their attacks with the main Soviet offensives, creating a second front behind enemy lines. Their relentless harassment added another layer of pressure on the already stretched German forces. Compounding the German predicament were Hitler's increasingly unrealistic fortress orders. Convinced that holding every inch of ground was the only way to prevent a complete collapse, Hitler issued directives forbidding retreats or tactical withdrawals, even when positions became untenable. He designated various cities and strongpoints as fortresses that were to be defended to the last man, regardless of the strategic consequences. These orders often led to further encirclements and catastrophic losses for German units, as they were trapped and annihilated by the advancing Red Army. Commanders on the ground, who understood the military realities, found themselves caught between impossible orders from above and the overwhelming pressure from the Soviet onslaught. These rigid directives severely hampered the German army's ability to conduct flexible defense, ultimately accelerating their great retreat across the Eastern Front. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now being systematically ground down, forced into a defensive posture that offered little hope of recovery. The stage was now set for one of the most decisive blows of the Eastern Front, a massive Soviet offensive known as Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet High Command, under Stalin's direct oversight, and with the brilliant tactical planning of generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, meticulously crafted a plan that relied heavily on strategic deception. Their goal was to convince the German leadership that the main Soviet summer offensive of 1944 would target the southern front, likely towards Ukraine or Romania, where the Germans had significant forces. This deception involved elaborate fake troop movements, radio traffic designed to mislead German intelligence, and the careful concealment of the true assault forces. Dummy tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces were positioned in the south, while the real concentrations of troops and equipment were secretly moved into position for an attack against Army Group Center in Belorussia. The deception worked almost perfectly, catching the Germans largely by surprise when the attack finally came. The colossal Soviet offensive, Operation Barbarossa, was launched on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after the start of Operation Barbarossa. It targeted Army Group Center, which stretched across Belorussia. The attack was unprecedented in its scale and ferocity, involving 4 Soviet fronts and over 2 million men, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The objective was nothing less than the complete annihilation of Army Group Center, a goal that many thought impossible given the strength of German defenses. However, the meticulous planning, the element of surprise, and the overwhelming numerical superiority the Soviets had achieved in the sector proved to be devastatingly effective. The initial hours and days of Operation Barbarossa saw the swift and devastating destruction of a large German army group, mirroring the scale of early Soviet defeats in 1941. German defensive lines, already thinned by troop transfers to other fronts and the demands of fighting partisans, were simply overwhelmed by the relentless Soviet assault. The Soviet forces punched through the German front in multiple places, creating deep penetrations and rapidly encircling German divisions. Communication lines were severed, supply routes were cut, and entire German corps found themselves trapped and cut off from the main body of the army. The speed and brutality of the Soviet advance left German commanders stunned and unable to react effectively. The once proud Army Group Center, which had spearheaded the drive to Moscow, was now being systematically dismantled. This was Blitzkrieg in reverse. The Red Army had mastered the art of deep operations, a military doctrine focused on achieving rapid breakthroughs and deep penetrations into enemy territory, followed by encirclements and the destruction of large enemy formations. They utilized combined arms tactics with devastating efficiency, coordinating infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support to achieve their objectives. Tank armies, acting as mobile strike forces, exploited gaps in the German lines, driving deep behind the front to seize key objectives and cut off retreat routes. The Soviet Air Force, now with air superiority, pounded German positions and interdicted any attempts at reinforcement or withdrawal. The result was a series of massive encirclements that trapped hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, who were either killed, captured, or scattered into disorganized remnants. A major symbolic and strategic victory was the liberation of Minsk, the capital of Belarusia. The city had been under German occupation for 3 years and was a vital communication and transportation hub for Army Group Center. Soviet forces liberated Minsk on July 3, 1944, after a rapid advance and a fierce battle. The recapture of Minsk highlighted the complete collapse of German resistance in the region and served as a powerful morale boost for the Soviet Union. The speed of the advance was such that many German units attempting to retreat westward ran directly into the Soviet spearheads, further compounding their losses. The capture of Minsk was not just a territorial gain. It was a clear sign that the tide had irrevocably turned against Germany on the Eastern Front. The success of Operation Barbarossa carried the Soviet advance deep into Poland, bringing them closer to German territory than ever before. The Red Army had not only destroyed Army Group Center, but had also created a massive gap in the German lines, opening the way for further offensives. The liberation of Soviet territory was nearing completion, and the war was now moving onto Axis soil. The implications were clear. The war was far from over, but the strategic initiative was firmly in Soviet hands. The German army was in full retreat, battered and broken, facing an enemy that was growing stronger, more experienced, and more determined with each passing day. The road to Berlin was now open, albeit still long and hard. The devastating success of Operation Barbarossa set the stage for the next monumental Soviet offensive, the Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945. After the summer campaigns of 1944, the Red Army had spent months regrouping, resupplying, and planning for the final push towards the heart of Germany. The winter of 1944-1945 saw the concentration of an unprecedented amount of Soviet military might along the front lines, particularly facing the German forces defending Poland. This was not just another offensive. It was designed to be the decisive stroke that would break the back of the German war machine and open the direct path to Berlin. The scale of the forces assembled for the Vistula-Oder offensive was truly staggering, reflecting the Soviet Union's commitment to ending the war swiftly. The Red Army deployed over 2 million soldiers, supported by more than 30 Jerusalem artillery pieces, nearly 7 Jerusalem tanks and self-propelled guns, and thousands of aircraft. This overwhelming concentration of manpower and material dwarfed the German forces arrayed against them, which were already stretched thin and depleted by years of brutal fighting. The Germans, under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner and Generaloberst Josef Harp, commanded roughly 400 Jerusalem men with a fraction of the tanks, artillery, and air support available to the Soviets. The numerical disparity was immense, setting the stage for a truly lopsided battle. When the offensive commenced on January 12, 1945, the initial impact was devastating. The Soviets unleashed a thunderous artillery barrage, unlike anything seen before on the Eastern Front, pounding German defensive positions for hours. This meticulously planned artillery preparation pulverized fortifications, disrupted communications, and shattered the morale of the German defenders. Following the artillery, wave after wave of Soviet infantry, supported by tanks, surged forward. The speed of the advance was incredible, with Soviet armies pushing through German lines at rates of up to 40 kilometers per day. This rapid pace caught the Germans completely off guard, preventing them from establishing coherent defensive fronts or organizing effective counterattacks. The German collapse was widespread and rapid. Entire divisions were destroyed, encircled, or forced into headlong retreats. The Red Army's tactics focused on deep penetration, bypassing pockets of resistance and driving straight for strategic objectives. This created a chaotic and fluid front, where German command and control quickly disintegrated. Supply lines were cut, units lost contact with each other, and the organized defense rapidly devolved into desperate, fragmented attempts to escape the Soviet onslaught. The sheer momentum of the Soviet advance was unstoppable, fueled by the desire to end the war and avenge the suffering inflicted on their homeland. A critical phase of the offensive involved crossing the Vistula River. The Vistula was a significant natural barrier, and the Germans had prepared defensive lines along its banks, hoping to stem the Soviet tide. However, the speed of the initial Soviet breakthrough meant that many German units were unable to properly man these defenses. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly, often under heavy fire, to construct pontoon bridges, allowing tanks and heavy equipment to cross. Infantry units, in many cases, crossed on improvised rafts or even on the ice, demonstrating incredible resilience and determination. The successful crossing of the Vistula was a major victory, removing a key geographical obstacle and opening the path further west. As the offensive continued, Soviet forces rapidly advanced through Poland, liberating city after city. They reached the Oder River, another major water barrier, by late January. The fact that the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers and reached the Oder in just over 2 weeks was a testament to the overwhelming force and tactical brilliance of the offensive. Reaching the Oder River placed Soviet forces within striking distance of Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. At its closest point, the front line was now less than 70 kilometers from the German capital. This rapid advance caused panic within the German high command. Hitler, holed up in his bunker, issued frantic and often contradictory orders, frequently demanding that non-existent divisions be moved to counter the Soviet threat. The German army was in tatters, its reserves exhausted, and its ability to mount a sustained defense severely compromised. The Vistula-Oder offensive had not only devastated German forces, but had also shattered any remaining illusion that Germany could still hold back the Red Army. The strategic initiative was now firmly and irrevocably with the Soviets. The war was coming home to Germany, and the final, brutal chapter was about to begin. The Red Army stood poised on the eastern bank of the Oder, looking towards Berlin, ready for the final assault. The Red Army now stood on the doorstep of Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality and confined to his underground bunker, clung to a desperate fantasy of victory. He saw enemies everywhere, real and imagined, and his orders grew more erratic, often contradicting military logic. He moved phantom armies on maps and demanded impossible counterattacks from shattered divisions. The defense of Berlin, once a symbol of Nazi power, became a macabre final act orchestrated by a paranoid dictator. Every available man, woman, and child was to be thrown into the grinder. The Soviet forces, after their astonishing dash across Poland, encircled Berlin with overwhelming numbers. The final assault on the capital began in earnest. This was no longer a war of maneuver across vast plains, but a brutal, grinding siege. The city itself became a labyrinth of death. Every street, every building, every subway tunnel was a potential battlefield. Soviet artillery pounded Berlin relentlessly, turning once grand avenues into smoking ruins and reducing entire districts to rubble. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of explosives. The fight was up close and personal, often hand-to-hand. In the shattered remains of homes and offices, the German defenders were a motley crew. Alongside the remnants of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, Hitler had called upon the Volkssturm, a militia made up of elderly men and boys, many with minimal training and inadequate weaponry. Child soldiers, barely teenagers, were pressed into service, armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, their youthful faces grim with fear and a misguided sense of duty. They fought with a desperate courage, born of fanaticism and the knowledge that surrender to the Soviets often meant a grim fate. These poorly equipped and often underage defenders were thrown into a meat grinder against the battle-hardened veterans of the Red Army, their sacrifice ultimately futile. One of the most symbolic and bloody battles within Berlin was the assault on the Reichstag building. Though largely symbolic, as the German government had long since moved, the Reichstag held immense psychological importance for both sides. For the Soviets, planting their flag atop its dome would signify the ultimate victory over Nazism. The fighting for the Reichstag was ferocious. German defenders, entrenched in its ruins, fought with suicidal determination. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks, clawed their way through the rubble, room by room, floor by floor. The iconic photograph of the Soviet flag being raised over the Reichstag became one of the enduring images of the war, a powerful symbol of triumph. While the battle raged above, Adolf Hitler spent his final days in the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Surrounded by his dwindling loyalists, he descended further into delusion, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's impending defeat. He married Eva Braun in a final, bizarre ceremony and dictated his last will and political testament. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops fought their way into the very streets above his bunker, Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself, while Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were hastily burned in the Chancellery garden, a grim end to the architect of so much destruction. Hitler's death signaled the final collapse of the Nazi regime. Though fighting continued for a few more days, as isolated pockets of German resistance tried to break out or hold their ground, the will to fight had evaporated. The news of Hitler's death, initially suppressed, quickly spread, extinguishing any last flicker of hope for the German military. The battle for Berlin was a brutal, apocalyptic climax to the Eastern Front, costing hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. It was a testament to the immense human cost of total war and the grim determination of the Soviet Union to see its enemy utterly defeated. The fall of Berlin was not just a military victory. It was the symbolic end of the Third Reich, a regime that had plunged Europe into unimaginable darkness. With the capital secured, the final act of the war in Europe was only days away. With Berlin fallen and Hitler dead, the last vestiges of German resistance crumbled. The formal surrender of Germany came on May 8, 1945, a day celebrated as Victory in Europe Day. This unconditional surrender brought an official end to the war in Europe, a conflict that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years. The document was signed in Berlin in the presence of representatives from the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. It was a momentous occasion, marking the defeat of Nazi Germany and the cessation of hostilities across a shattered continent. For the Soviet Union, this moment was the culmination of an immense and brutal struggle, a hard-won victory achieved at an almost unimaginable cost. Amidst the final days of the war, a truly symbolic event unfolded that underscored the alliance, however strained, between the Eastern and Western powers. On April 25, 1945, advance elements of the American 69th Infantry Division and the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division met near Torgau on the Elbe River. This meeting, famously captured in photographs, represented the physical link-up of the two main forces that had been driving towards the heart of Germany from opposite directions. Soldiers from both sides, initially cautious, quickly embraced, exchanging cigarettes, souvenirs and stories through interpreters. The meeting on the Elbe became a powerful symbol of the Allied victory, a visual representation of the final squeeze on Nazi Germany. It was a moment of shared triumph, even as the seeds of future geopolitical tensions were already being sown. The cost of victory on the Eastern Front was immense, almost beyond comprehension. For the Soviet Union, the human toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but it is widely accepted that the USSR suffered around 27 million casualties, both military and civilian, representing a significant portion of its total population. This figure includes millions of soldiers killed in combat, starved in German prisoner of war camps, or civilians who perished due to bombings, starvation, disease, and deliberate Nazi extermination policies. The sheer scale of this loss dwarfs that of any other nation involved in the war. Germany, too, paid a heavy price, with millions of soldiers killed or wounded, and its cities reduced to rubble. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder unlike any other, characterized by a level of brutality and suffering rarely seen in human history. Beyond the human cost, the material destruction across Eastern Europe was widespread and devastating. Cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, Minsk and Kiev were almost entirely obliterated, their infrastructure, buildings and cultural heritage reduced to dust. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Factories, railways, bridges, and agricultural lands were systematically destroyed, either by the retreating Germans in their scorched earth policy or by the relentless fighting itself. The economies of the affected regions were in ruins, and the task of reconstruction would be monumental, taking decades to achieve. The landscape itself bore the scars of conflict, pockmarked with craters, littered with debris, and poisoned by unexploded ordnance. The end of the war also triggered massive movements of people across the devastated continent. Millions of displaced persons, including former prisoners of war, forced laborers, and refugees, sought to return home or find new places to live. Ethnic Germans were expelled from territories in Eastern Europe, leading to further displacement and hardship. Borders were redrawn, populations shifted, and new national identities began to form in the aftermath of the conflict. The sheer scale of these migrations and the humanitarian crisis they created presented an enormous challenge for the victorious powers and the newly formed international organizations. The world was faced with the immediate task of feeding, housing, and repatriating millions of uprooted individuals, all while dealing with the trauma of war. The immediate political and territorial changes in Europe were profound and set the stage for the next global confrontation. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly divided. Eastern European countries liberated by the Red Army, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, increasingly fell under Soviet influence, forming a bloc of communist states. The Soviet Union itself annexed territories, expanding its borders westward. This new geopolitical landscape, characterized by 2 dominant superpowers with vastly different ideologies, directly led to the beginning of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill, would soon descend across Europe, dividing the continent for nearly half a century. The end of the war was not a return to peace, but rather a transition into a new era of global tension and ideological struggle. The seeds of future conflicts were sown in the ashes of the Third Reich, a direct consequence of the war's brutal conclusion. The immense sacrifice of the Soviet Union in defeating Nazi Germany is a truth that cannot be overstated. While the Western Allies fought bravely and made crucial contributions, it was on the Eastern Front that the vast majority of German military casualties occurred. Estimates suggest that between 75% and 80% of all German military deaths during World War II happened in the war against the Soviet Union. This staggering figure highlights the sheer scale of the conflict and the brutal effectiveness of the Red Army in grinding down the Wehrmacht. The Soviet people endured unimaginable suffering, losing an estimated 27 million lives, both military and civilian, representing a far greater loss than any other nation involved. Their resilience, determination, and willingness to fight to the last man were pivotal in turning the tide of the war and ultimately securing victory against Hitler's regime. Without the Eastern Front, the war would have undoubtedly lasted longer, and its outcome would have been far less certain. However, the Eastern Front was also a crucible of unspeakable atrocities committed by both sides. The ideological nature of the conflict, with Nazism viewing Slavs as subhuman and communism as an existential threat, fueled a level of brutality rarely seen. The German invasion was accompanied by systematic mass killings of Jews, Roma, and Soviet commissars, carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and other units. The deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, leading to millions of deaths, stands as one of the war's darkest chapters. On the Soviet side, while fighting to liberate their homeland, Red Army soldiers also engaged in widespread acts of violence, particularly against German civilians, including rape, looting, and summary executions, especially as they advanced into German territory. These ethical dilemmas and the moral compromises made in the name of total war left deep scars on the collective memory of the nations involved. The suffering of civilians, caught between two ruthless ideologies, remains a tragic testament to the destructive power of unchecked hatred. The intense combat of the Eastern Front also spurred rapid technological advancements and tactical innovations. Both sides continually adapted their military doctrines and equipment to gain an edge. German Blitzkrieg tactics, initially so successful, were eventually countered by Soviet deep operations and defensive strategies. The development of new tank designs, like the Soviet T-34 and the German Panther and Tiger, pushed the boundaries of armored warfare. Artillery tactics evolved, with the Soviets mastering massed artillery barrages to soften defenses before infantry and tank assaults. Air warfare saw constant innovation in close air support and ground attack roles. The need to operate in extreme conditions, from the freezing Russian winter to the muddy spring thaws, forced engineers to develop more robust and reliable equipment. These technological leaps and tactical shifts had a lasting impact on military thought and continue to influence modern warfare today. The Eastern Front's outcome profoundly impacted global politics, fundamentally reshaping the post-war world order. The Soviet Union emerged from the conflict as a superpower, its military might and ideological influence extending across Eastern Europe. The division of Europe into East and West, marked by the Iron Curtain, was a direct consequence of the Red Army's advance and the subsequent political settlements. The United States, having also emerged as a superpower, found itself in an ideological and geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union, leading to the Cold War. This new bipolar world, dominated by two nuclear-armed giants, defined international relations for the next 4 decades. The Eastern Front, therefore, was not just a theater of war. It was the birthplace of a new global order, one characterized by proxy conflicts, an arms race, and a constant struggle for influence. How the Eastern Front is remembered and commemorated varies significantly across different countries today. In Russia and other former Soviet states, it is often referred to as the Great Patriotic War, a sacred struggle for national survival against an existential threat. Victory Day, May 9th, is a major national holiday, celebrated with parades and reverence for the sacrifices made. In Germany, the memory is one of profound shame and introspection, acknowledging the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Memorials and museums focus on remembrance, reconciliation, and education about the horrors of war and totalitarianism. In Western Europe and the United States, while the Eastern Front's significance is recognized by historians, its scale and brutality are often less understood by the general public, overshadowed by the narratives of their own involvement. These differing national memories reflect distinct historical experiences and political contexts. The enduring lessons learned from the Eastern Front are numerous and profound. It stands as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of total war, where entire societies are mobilized for conflict and the lines between combatant and civilian blur. It highlights the dangers of unchecked ideological hatred and expansionism, demonstrating how such forces can lead to unparalleled barbarity. The resilience of human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, is another crucial lesson. It also underscores the importance of strategic foresight, the impact of logistical challenges, and the continuous evolution of military tactics. The Eastern Front teaches us about the fragility of peace, the cost of aggression, and the enduring human capacity for both immense cruelty and extraordinary courage. Its legacy continues to inform our understanding of conflicts, past and present, and serves as a powerful cautionary tale for future generations. The Eastern Front continues to be a fertile ground for historical inquiry, leading to ongoing discussions and controversies among historians. One of the most debated topics remains the exact casualty figures, particularly for the Soviet Union. Estimates vary widely, reflecting the incomplete records, the chaos of war, and differing methodologies for counting military and civilian deaths. Some analyses suggest even higher numbers than previously thought, underscoring the immense demographic catastrophe that befell the Soviet peoples. Strategic decisions, both German and Soviet, also fuel constant debate. Was Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union an inevitable outcome of Nazi ideology or a catastrophic miscalculation? Could the Red Army have avoided its early encirclements, or were they a necessary cost of drawing the Germans deeper into Soviet territory? These questions are complex, often without simple answers, and new archival discoveries or analytical approaches frequently shift established understandings. The role of Lend-Lease aid from the Western Allies is another area of contention, with some historians emphasizing its critical contribution to Soviet war efforts, while others argue its impact was secondary to Soviet industrial output and human sacrifice. These historiographical debates are not merely academic exercises. They shape national narratives and influence how the war is understood globally. Beyond academic circles, the Eastern Front has left an indelible mark on cultural landscapes, its representation in literature, film, and art shaping public perception. Soviet and later Russian cinema frequently depicted the Great Patriotic War as an epic struggle of national unity and heroic sacrifice, often focusing on particular battles like Stalingrad or the defense of Moscow. Films such as Ballad of a Soldier or The Cranes Are Flying offered more personal, poignant perspectives on the human cost. In Western culture, the Eastern Front often appeared as a brutal, almost incomprehensible theater, sometimes depicted with a focus on German perspectives or the sheer scale of the suffering. Books like Stalingrad by Anthony Beevor or Enemy at the Gates brought the intensity of the conflict to a wider English-speaking audience. Art, from propaganda posters to solemn paintings, also captured the era's spirit, portraying scenes of devastation, resistance, and eventual triumph. These cultural products, whether fact-based or fictionalized, play a crucial role in transmitting the memory of the Eastern Front across generations, influencing collective memory and understanding, though often through a specific national or ideological lens. The long-term effects of the Eastern Front on the geopolitical landscape were profound and continue to resonate today. The Soviet Union's emergence as a dominant land power in Europe, cemented by the Red Army's victory, directly led to the division of the continent. The formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization by Western powers was a direct response to perceived Soviet expansionism, creating a military alliance designed to contain communism. In turn, the Soviet Union and its satellite states formed the Warsaw Pact, establishing a clear ideological and military fault line across Europe. This Cold War division, characterized by an arms race and proxy conflicts, lasted for over 4 decades, fundamentally shaping international relations and creating a world order that persisted until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Even after the Cold War, the legacy of the Eastern Front influenced geopolitical dynamics, particularly in Eastern Europe, where historical grievances and national identities forged during the war continue to impact regional stability and relations with Russia. Amidst the grand narratives of battles and political shifts, it is crucial to reflect on the individual experiences of soldiers and civilians caught in the maelstrom of the Eastern Front. Millions of men, barely out of their teens, were thrust into unimaginably brutal combat, enduring freezing winters, starvation, and constant fear. Their letters home, diaries, and later testimonies offer a glimpse into the psychological toll of such sustained violence. Civilians, too, faced unimaginable hardship, sieges, forced labor, massacres, and the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. Women played vital roles, not only in factories and agriculture, but also on the front lines as snipers, pilots, and medics. The stories of resilience, camaraderie, and sacrifice, but also of despair, moral compromise, and atrocity, paint a complex human picture of the war. These personal narratives humanize the vast statistics, reminding us that behind every number was a life irrevocably altered or extinguished by the conflict. The Eastern Front stands as a stark testament to the ultimate failure of expansionist and genocidal ideologies in the face of determined resistance. Nazi Germany's ambition to conquer and enslave the Slavic peoples, to implement a brutal racial hierarchy, and to create a vast living space for its own population ultimately crumbled under the weight of its own barbarity and the fierce opposition it encountered. The Red Army's victory, achieved at an almost incomprehensible cost, demonstrated that even the most formidable military machine, fueled by a hateful ideology, could be defeated by a nation fighting for its very existence. This historical outcome serves as a powerful reminder that while ideologies can incite immense violence and destruction, they are not invincible. The collective will to resist, coupled with immense sacrifice and strategic determination, can ultimately overcome even the most aggressive and destructive forces. The continued importance of studying the Eastern Front to understand modern conflicts and the fragility of peace cannot be overstated. Its lessons about the dangers of unchecked nationalism, the consequences of ideological extremism, and the devastating impact of total war remain acutely relevant. In a world still grappling with ethnic conflicts, territorial disputes, and the rise of authoritarianism, the Eastern Front offers a historical mirror, reflecting the potential depths of human cruelty and the incredible capacity for resilience. It teaches us about the critical role of logistics, the psychological impact of war, and the complex interplay of political, military, and social factors in shaping conflict. By understanding this titanic struggle, we gain crucial insights into the mechanisms of war and the enduring quest for peace, ensuring that the sacrifices made on the Eastern Front are not forgotten, and its profound lessons continue to guide future generations in navigating the complexities of a volatile world. The echoes of those 418 days of total war resonate through time, a permanent fixture in humanity's collective memory.